So let's dive into the first album. So Led Zeppelin 4, this comes out in 1971. Do you remember the first time you heard this album?
Oh yeah, sure. Well, I had heard Stairway, of course, on the radio as a kid growing up in Southern Ontario in the 1970s. Stairway was the last song to every dance you ever went to, right? So you went to a dance, you knew the last song was Stairway. You tried to get a girl that you liked because it was long. You'd get to dance with her for a long time. There was always that sort of uncomfortable moment where it sort of picks up in tempo because you're in the middle of a slow dance, and do you then go fast or do you not? Anyway, I would just hang on to the girl and keep dancing.
That's also a big commitment if you end up with the wrong person for 8 minutes.
True, very true. But yeah, so I had heard some, I delved into my brothers and my sisters' music catalogs as a younger kid, and just listened to whatever I could. My brother had, Sabbath records, and he had Zeppelin 2 and Zeppelin 3. He never had Zeppelin 1, but he had 2 and 3, and I listened to that. Anyway, I went out and I bought 4 records as the first 4 records I ever bought. And the first one was Zeppelin 4. This was all at the same time. I saved up my money, went down to the record store, got Zeppelin 4, got Fleetwood Mac Rumors, got Hotel California by the Eagles, and Joe's Garage by Frank Zappa.
Only 4 of the greatest albums of all time. You had impeccable taste even back then.
Well, I don't know that I did. I think there was less to choose from, right? There was just like rock was rock. It was, unless you were a pop fan. Well, the first, I think I told you this, the first 45 I ever bought was On Top of the World, right? By the Carpenters. But I was pretty young when I got that, but then I got into the rock, and yeah, Zeppelin 4, I put that on. I was actually, my brother was traveling in Belgium at the time, so I'd taken over his room and his stereo, and I put it on, and I sat in his room and I listened to it, and it was just earth-shattering, like just everything about it. So exciting. The drum sounds at Headley Grange that they got, and then Battle of Evermore, this atmospheric-y, like, what's a mandolin? Well, I don't know what a mandolin was, but this amazing sound. And Sandy Denny, right, who I didn't really know anything about because I wasn't from England at the time. I hadn't been to England, so all these things, it was just like, as a young kid, it blows your mind, right?
What's wild is Sandy Denny. So that's the Battle of Evermore, I believe, and that's the only female vocal on a Led Zeppelin recording ever, period. Like, that's so historic right there.
Now, Plant later on sang with, a bunch of people, so a bunch of females, Alison Krauss, most famously, Patty Griffin, right? So, he has done since, but yeah, that at the time for Led Zeppelin, that was it. She was a very famous English folk singer, Sandy Denny. She was she wasn't unknown. So
they just announced the lineup for Blues Fest in Ottawa, and you have Robert Plant and Alison Krauss. They're playing, so I got my tickets. So I'm gonna see Robert Plant. I mean, that's amazing. That's gonna be life-changing. You were talking about
together. They definitely make incredible music.
You were talking about the amazing drum sounds on the album, and you mentioned that When the Levee Breaks, that's one of the most sampled drums for 80s hip hop. I've over the years I've heard John Bonham's drum sound. I've heard it said that it sounds like a drum kit on top of a mountaintop being recorded. Have you ever heard that, or how would you describe his massive drum sound?
I mean, it comes from the player, right? I actually spoke to John Paul Jones about this at one point. He would come down to Real World and work quite a lot. So, obviously we asked him, said, that drum sound in Levee Breaks, how'd you get that? And he said, basically, it's what the front hall of Headley Grange sounded like. 2 M88, Bayer Dynamic M88 microphones, one 10 feet away, one 20 feet away. That's just what it sounded like. There was no secret. It was just, there was a delay, there's the Binson that they used. That was the tape delay effect on it. But basically that's how he sounded when he played. It's just incredible.
So you just mentioned that you have a history. You've spoken with John Paul Jones, and I remember in our last interview, you had a story about Jimmy Page and Robert Plant. You've essentially talked to all the living members of Led Zeppelin. How meaningful was that to you as one of your all-time favorite bands that you actually have been able to communicate with them?
It was huge. So I told you this story last time, but I'll reiterate it again for anybody who didn't see the last one. I was making a record with another band called Orphic Soup, actually, in England. And I got the call to just come to meet with these guys to maybe do a Page Plant record, which didn't end up happening. It was the one that Steve Albini ended up working on. But there I was, this huge fan going into a management office where I sat on the edge of a couch that was bigger than my apartment at the time and played Tool for two guys from Led Zeppelin. And it was an absolute thrill. And I was shitting myself, to be honest. But they were very gracious. Were very complimentary about the work that I had done. And, we tried to work something out. Schedule-wise, we couldn't, unfortunately, but they were great to meet. And it was a real honor, I felt, to be able to speak to some heroes of mine and potentially get a chance to work with them.
When I shared that clip of you sharing the story of playing a Tool album for members of Led Zeppelin, the Tool fans went wild, that they said they would have given anything to be able to watch members of Led Zeppelin listening to Tool. So that was pretty cool.
It was pretty interesting. I mean, Robert said the voice was very quiet. That was his take on it. But Jimmy said he loved the guitars. So, I lost on one and I won on the other.
When I think of Led Zeppelin, I think of like the epitome of rock stars. It's like you had the crowd and then you had this band that was larger than life on stage. They played up that image. They basically created the image of rock star. And each of the four musicians individually are considered all-time greats at those instruments. This was like a super group from the start.
Well, they were at least Page and John Paul Jones were seasoned session musicians beforehand. They sort of left essentially what would be a first call job in London for doing all the sessions, and all their buddies thought they were nuts joining a stupid rock band when they could be making a good living being musicians, just on-call musicians in London. So and they managed to find the other two. And Bonham was an enigma, right? There was nobody like him. Nobody like him since. Right. He just had one of those, even John Paul Jones said, it's like, I played with the best. Like the feel, it's not so much like the sound is one thing, but the feel was what made it so good. And the feel between that rhythm section was incredible. And nobody's really matched it in that kind of avenue that we had, that sort of early 70s rock blues style, the kind of backbeat, the way that they would sit, in the pocket, in the groove. I mean, there are great musicians today, and I shouldn't take anything away from musicians of today, but there was something that they had that really was, pretty unique, at least at the time. And yeah, the fact that again, like any good band, the different musicians had different interests in music. They love the blues, obviously, but Plant loved North Moroccan African music, North African music, and the Jimmy and John Paul had this roots in folk music and skiffle music in England. So they brought different things to the group and created something completely unique out of it.
When you see the list of greatest drummers of all time, you always have John Bonham in the top 10. And when you hear from world-class musicians and they list their top influences, again, you always have John Bonham there. So I guess he had such a massive impact on the lives of drummers.
Yep. The feel. It's all about the feel that he had. Like, the big sound. He was a big guy and he played big drums and he hit them very hard, but he could also play softly and he just grooved like crazy. It was, he just had something that very few people have. Others have great feel, of course. I'm not saying that, Steve's got amazing feel, of course, but the what they had and the heaviness that they had and the pocket that they had was just something so unique, and you hear it and it's undeniable.
So the album comes out in 1971. It goes on to be one of the best-selling albums of all time, sells over 37 million copies, which is ridiculous. That's essentially everyone in Canada owning a copy, which is crazy. And at one point, it was in the top 5 best-selling albums of all time. And then as albums get released since then, some overtake it. There's only 8 songs on the album. And even though there's only 2 official singles, Black Dog and Rock and Roll, basically all 8 songs are very well known in public consciousness. That's how popular that album was. And
I say maybe Four Sticks was the least well known of that album, but I mean, Stairway to Heaven, not really a single, but who doesn't know that song?
Apparently, it was getting airplay on FM stations, even though it wasn't a single, and it was super popular. And the band, for some reason, just always said, no, we don't want this as a single. They never latched onto that as wanting to push that.
They didn't need to.
That's a very good point. Yeah. One thing that blows my mind is the final mix of the album. So the album as the world knows it was not the original mix. Apparently it was mixed for 10 days, and then the band sat down and listened to it and they hated the mix. And then Page took it and remixed the album, which is the one that we know. So can you imagine a world where there's a different mix to that album? I mean, that's crazy. That blows my mind.
It happens a lot. You'd be surprised. I mean, the Michael Jackson, I can't remember which song it was, but it was like something off of Thriller, I think, maybe the lead song. Anyway, there was a song that had 110 mixes, and they went back and listened. It's like, actually, mix 3, that's the one. Excuse me. So, it happens. I mean, when you mix something for a long period of time, you can lose your perspective on things. And sometimes you just need to change the scenery, do something quick, and off you go,
So Stairway to Heaven, I mean, this is, one of the most famous songs of all time. This is one of the greatest guitar solos of all time. Every guitarist that's picked up a guitar has learned that song at some point. So with Jeff Beck passing away not that long ago, I found something that I wanted to share, is that Page played the guitar solo using a Fender Telecaster he received from Jeff Beck. So I thought that was pretty sweet. And apparently he recorded 3 solos. And then the one that we hear is it was his favorite of the 3 solos. He just riffed off 3 solos and they chose one of them.
Mm-hmm. That's, it's that solo is absolutely iconic for sure. A lot of the great players, I mean, I do lots of guitar comping, of course, and solo comping over the years, but some of the great ones, they meditate on it, like Fripp would do. You'd meditate on a solo, you'd figure out, what I'm thinking about doing, and then you just go for it. And 2 or 3 times, the inspiration flows. When you're that great a guitar player, the inspiration flows, and it's better to do like 2 or 3, choose the best one of those, rather than going through 100 and chopping notes out here and there.
So with Stairway to Heaven being 8 minutes and being a massive hit, how much of an influence do you think Stairway to Heaven had on all the future epic songs that bands put out that started off slow and built into a full band? So I'm thinking of songs after that, like Freebird, November Rain, Shine on You Crazy Diamond, Bohemian Rhapsody. It seemed like with Led Zeppelin having Stairway to Heaven, that every band after that, they wanted kind of that one song that matched that equally for epicness. Do you think there's any truth to that it had an influence?
I think maybe it did. Sure. I mean, any super popular piece of culture will have an influence on artists down the road. I think it probably opened the door for the possibility, because obviously at the time, pop music was like, if it was, and still we do this, right? If it's longer than 3.5 minutes, excuse me, nobody's going to care, right? So you think, well, you can point to Zeppelin did it. They were able to do it. They, Bohemian Rhapsody was able to do it. Pink Floyd was able to do it. You can make the argument if somebody has been successful by doing this, so let's give it a shot.
They set a precedence that it's possible to have a song that's twice as long as most singles and still have it be a big hit. A couple more things and we'll move on to the next album. So Rolling Stone has this listed as the 69th greatest album of all time on the top 500. And there's a retrospective review I thought you'd enjoy. So All Music credited the album for defining not only Led Zeppelin, but the sound and style of the 70s hard rock, while encompassing heavy metal, folk, pure rock and roll, and blues. So I thought you maybe would agree with that.
They would dispute the heavy metal thing. They never viewed themselves as a heavy metal band at all. They were a blues band in their minds.
Yeah, you hear that Led Zeppelin are part of the godfathers that started metal. And I checked to double check because a lot of people associate Black Sabbath as being the start of that. So I checked the dates, and 2 Black Sabbath albums were 1970, and then this was 1971. So apparently it's between those 2 bands that there was heavier popular music coming out that would be the start of heavy metal.
I'd say between Tony Iommi and Jimmy, they kind of defined riff as a style of writing, right? Black Dog's great riff, right? Like they made riffs that were the foundations of what metal has become now. But I would say they would push back on the metal label.
Yeah, I guess they were just a heavier blues band. Do you think they'd be okay with hard rock, or is that still a little too heavy than what they?
I don't know. You'd have to ask them, but I know that I've heard Robert really push back on the metal thing.